The National Complete Streets Coalition, a program of Smart Growth America, is a nonprofit, nonpartisan alliance of public interest organizations and transportation professionals committed to the development and implementation of complete streets policies and practice. A nationwide movement launched by the coalition in 2004, Complete Streets is the integration of people in place into planning, design, construction, operation, and maintenance of transportation networks. To date, we're lucky that over 1,500 communities have adopted complete streets policies in the United States, and that's reflected in all 50 states, Puerto Rico, and the District of Columbia. The National Complete Streets Coalition was formed about 15 years ago by our partner organizations, many of whom you can see today on the screen, who really were formed with the idea that they wanted to get federal transportation policy passed that would, again, put people first. And the story was that they wanted to make complete streets, or planning for all users, part of the routine accommodations when using federal dollars on the transportation system. Over the years, particularly in the FAST Act, which was the last federal transportation reauthorization, we have started to get language that starts to support complete streets at, again, the federal level, but there's so much more to do. And so that's why we're really excited today to talk to you about what's been going on in Capitol Hill and how this impacts your communities and how you might help get this Complete Streets Act passed. This is all, of course, under a larger background of what's going on with pedestrian safety and really vulnerable user safety within the country. Unfortunately, the data shows that more and more people are being killed while walking. This graph right in front of you shows that since 2008, pedestrian fatalities have continued to rise. Those numbers were actually adjusted a few weeks ago when the federal government came out with new numbers that show that graph is only going up. And what that means is that even as traffic fatalities overall are going down, we are still killing more people outside the vehicle. And what that means is that people walking, rolling, and that could be on a scooter, that could be in a wheelchair, on a bicycle, kind of anyone outside of the car is those fatalities are going up even though we're making vehicular travel safer. So according to the National Highway Traffic Safety Data's Fatality Analysis Reporting System data, 6,283 people were killed last year walking on streets in the United States and 857 people on bikes or similar non-motorized vehicles were killed. That's, in fact, an increase of 3.4% and 6.3% respectively. Federal officials say these rises were concentrated in urban areas. And again, I mentioned that while we're driving more and walking less, getting in fewer car crashes, we're still killing more people on foot than ever before. And I should mention you can find all of these graphics in our Dangerous by Design report, which is available for free for download on www.smartgrowthamerica.org. So unfortunately, these crashes and these fatalities are not on accident. Our streets are dangerous by design, and we're incentivizing this kind of infrastructure by having federal funding priorities that incentivize the building of transportation systems for cars and for speed, not for people and mobility. And that's why we're really excited that we've worked with our partners on Capitol Hill to introduce legislation that prioritizes people's safety, and that's the Complete Streets Act of 2019. We are very fortunate that we worked with Senator Ed Markey from Massachusetts on the Senate side and Representative Steve Cohen from Tennessee, and that's the Memphis area, on the House side. This federal program was really modeled after an extremely successful Complete Streets state program within the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. The State Department of Massachusetts launched a 3-tier Complete Streets funding program to encourage towns and cities to adopt Complete Streets policies, thinking critically about how to prioritize projects, and then implement changes on the ground. And all of this and what I'll go over is really the basis for a good portion of the Complete Streets Act of 2019. So MassDOT created this three-tier system, and this was an act by the legislature of Massachusetts to, again, incentivize more communities in Massachusetts to adopt Complete Streets policies, but then they also wanted to help those policies turn into practice. And what that means is into implementation and eventually into pavement. So through these three tiers, what they did is first they required in Tier 1, they required an eligible entity to send a representative to attend a Complete Streets training. So to figure out what is really a complete streets approach, meaning you're not just planning one bike lane or one multimodal street, but you're thinking about how to transform the transportation network for all users. Then the town or the city was required to adopt a strong complete streets policy, and they determined that strength based on a grading system that MassDOT actually used based on the National Complete Streets Policy Framework, and they had to get an 80 out of 100 score in order to be eligible for the next tier. So once they go through this, then towns and cities are eligible for funding for technical assistance to help them develop a 5-year prioritization plan for complete streets investments in their town and city. And what this does is actually it gives them funding to think through how they actually prioritize projects once they become eligible for complete streets funding. Finally, towns and cities with an approved prioritization plan can receive up to $400,000 per year to implement projects, meaning they actually get $400,000 of infrastructure dollars every year. I should say that all of this was funded with a $50 million grant that the legislature adopted to help make this pass. What this has resulted in is now over half the towns and cities in Massachusetts have adopted Complete Streets policies, and almost 90% attended the Complete Streets training. As of May 2019, 198 communities passed policies approved by the state, which means they're really good policies. 161 completed those Complete Streets prioritization plans, and the state has funded 106 Complete Streets projects over 3 years. Dozens of communities throughout the state and the state itself have committed to continue this work under the network of age-friendly states and communities with AARP. And I should mention, as many of you know, we grade Complete Streets policies every year, and we can say that since this program has passed, Massachusetts has the most number of Complete Streets policies in the state, but not only that, they have the most number of high scoring, so really good policies. And again, those policies, because they're built on a strong foundation, are turning into implementation and eventually projects. So we're really working to scale up this version of this highly successful program into the Federal Transportation Funding Bill, or this Federal Transportation Bill, which my colleague Scott will explain next. And this photo right here is from this photo right here, is from a roundtable Representative Cohen in Memphis hosted a few weeks ago. That's me on the left, and Representative Cohen on the right. Where we met with leaders from not just the biking community, but from the Memphis Medical District, from FedEx, from a lot of local walking and biking advocacy groups, from housing groups, from the city, to talk about why Complete Streets matters so much in Memphis. Memphis is unfortunately one of the most dangerous places to walk or bike in the United States, and what this bill will do for them. I should also mention, as a good part of this bill is this funding program, which will be huge for getting communities of all sizes Complete Streets projects in their communities, but also at the core of this act is language that will require the Secretary of Transportation, in that case right now it's Elaine Chao at USDOT, to require that states and MPOs, when they're using federal dollars, consider all users when touching the transportation system. What that means, in other words, is anytime they're using your dollars, taxpayer dollars, they're thinking about everyone who touches the road. And unbelievably, although that message has started to reach our cities or some of our states and parts of the federal government, we still use our dollars to prioritize, again, the high-speed movement of vehicles and not people. And what we wind up with is we wind up with a lot more funding for highways and highway capacity versus building transportation that actually moves goods and services and people, most importantly, to be able to access their essential places. And that means that that when we're using those taxpayer dollars, people who are building those systems are thinking about how someone, regardless of how they want or need to travel, may it be a bicycle, a wheelchair, a scooter, their feet, a car, walking to transit or walking the whole trip, they can get there in a safe, reliable, affordable way. The other thing I'll mention about this funding program is that currently each state DOT would be responsible for administering it. The grant program would also be $500,000 a year, so that's a little bit more than the current $400,000 a year, but that every community within the state, should they pass a strong Complete Streets policy, would be eligible to receive that funding. They would also have to go through many of the same steps as Massachusetts, so they would have to go through a Complete Streets training, put together some type of list or prioritization plan, participate in technical assistance, and then be able to build those projects. Currently, many communities cite that funding is one of their biggest barriers to really help push them over the top once they get that policy into practice. So if you'll remember, I said there are 1,500 Complete Streets policies in the United States. We want to make sure that each one of those communities, each one of those 1,500, has a chance to start building, to build success projects, to get their communities excited about what this might mean on the ground. However, it's going to take a lot of work. I know that myself and many of my colleagues, we spend a lot of time on Capitol Hill walking those halls. And I have to tell you, they're pretty empty compared to kind of other causes right now. And so we really need all of your help to get your congressional representatives activated and excited. Right now we have 18 sponsors on the House side and 3 on the Senate side, but really this is going to take a big push from all of you. So if you want safer streets, you need to make your voices heard. We're going to dive into more detail on what the new transportation bill may or may not do, but remember that we can't get anything passed without the support of people like yourself. So after this webinar, we'll be following up in ways that you can take action, but you can also become organizers in your own community to take action to get safer streets. The last thing I'm going to say before I turn it over to Scott is that I travel all around the country, and I am so excited and activated by what I see at the local level. In fact, I live in Washington, D.C., but I'm not there today because I'm out really in a community working on the streets. On Friday, I had to spend time in San Antonio, which is a community really committed to safety there. But without strong federal policy, it's going to be an uphill battle because most of the states really defer to the federal government when it comes to how to spend and implement taxpayer transportation dollars. And unfortunately, the states, again, are still prioritizing speed over people. And so we need the strong federal legislation. So with that, we will follow up with some more descriptions on the bill after this, but I want to make sure to turn it over to my colleague Scott. Scott's the policy director at Transportation for America, which is our sister organization, which does incredible work making sure that we have strong federal transportation policy. I don't want to steal Scott's thunder, but they're really pushing a platform that puts policy first over funding. And that reminds me, I also want to share that all of the funding for this bill would not be new funding, but we'd actually ask states to reprioritize 5% of their existing funding towards this Complete Streets program. So again, this is not a new funding bill. This would be having states reprioritize their existing dollars to build people-first projects. And from there, I'll turn it over to Scott that can really talk more about what it means when you put policy first in a transportation platform. And there you go, Scott.
Thanks, Emiko, and hello, everybody. I'm going to try to pick up a little bit of where Emiko left off, but I might step back a little bit and reiterate a few things she said because we think that they're very important. But as Emiko mentioned, I'm the policy director at Transportation for America, and we're going to talk a little bit about what's happening at the federal level and how the Complete Streets Act fits into that. So you've seen this already. There's two bills in the House and Senate. Let's go to the next slide. Just to kind of reiterate a bit on what Emiko said, the Complete Streets Act requires states to set aside 5% of their highway funds for complete streets projects. It creates a statewide program in each state to award the money and provide technical assistance and support. And it requires the adoption of design standards that support safer, complete streets. And again, you've seen this already before, but the Senate bill has two co-sponsors. Senator Markey introduced it. He's from Massachusetts, and then Senator Blumenthal and Senator Schatz have co-sponsored it from Connecticut and Hawaii. And here you're looking at a map of the 20 most dangerous states for pedestrians. This comes from the Dangerous by Design report that Emiko mentioned earlier. And I'll just reiterate the website once again. It's smartgrowthamerica.org/dangerous-by-design. It's important to mention this here when we're talking about the Senate bill because all of those states are incredibly dangerous. All those in red and the lighter shade of red are incredibly dangerous for pedestrians. The senators who represent those states are not yet supportive of the bill. And for those of you on this call who might be from one of those states, we really strongly encourage you to share this information. It's all on the website with your senators and to encourage them to co-sponsor this bill. Moving on now, you see the House co-sponsors. As Emiko mentioned, there's 18. So we have a little bit more representation there. But as we'll show you in the next slide, we've identified the most dangerous congressional districts in the country. We've ranked all 435 congressional districts and ranked them in order of pedestrian danger. Looking at the map, you'll see there's a lot of overlap with the most dangerous states, but there are districts elsewhere in the country outside of those 20 most dangerous states that pedestrians are facing some significant danger. And so I mention that because you'll see on the next slide, we just show you the top 14, but you can see all 435 on the website, and you can see the rank. Number one there is Congressman Gallego from Arizona's 7th District. He is a co-sponsor, you can see on the far right. And then as you go down there, number 3, Mr. Clyburn, he's not a co-sponsor. Number 5, represented by Charlie Crist, not a co-sponsor, and on and on and on. So you can look up your specific congressional district, and you can identify whether your Congress member is a co-sponsor, and then you can call him or her. And we certainly encourage you to do so, and as Emiko mentioned, we'll be following up after this call with how you can take action. So that's a little bit of reiterating what Emiko said, and hopefully a little bit more information with the dangerous states and dangerous congressional districts. But I really wanted to just explain where this bill fits into the broader picture of what Congress is doing and how we can hope to get this passed. So we're going to talk, as you saw, about the path forward. So this may be something everybody in this call knows, but just to set the baseline, every roughly 5 years, Congress has to approve a surface transportation authorization. And so it's called a reauthorization because every 5 years they reauthorize what they've done. So we're getting ready for the next reauthorization because the current law, the FAST Act, expires next year. And what the reauthorization will do is it will set federal policy, and it will set the funding amounts that can be best invested in those policies. And then it follows to the appropriators, in some cases to appropriate the money for those policies. But in other cases, like with highways, it's funded out of the Highway Trust Fund. And so those dollars are not appropriated. They're automatic every year by formula. And so the federal reauthorization has an enormous influence on whether we can build complete streets in our country. So what has happened so far? Only one of the committees with jurisdiction in either the House or the Senate has taken any action. That's the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee. They introduced a bill and they passed that bill called America's Transportation Infrastructure Act. And they got a lot of great press for having a safety title and some other, bold stances, or at least things that many consider to be bold stances in the bill. But what we want to make sure to share with folks on this call is that, number one, they didn't quite have the Complete Streets Act in there. You may have seen some press about that. They had a little bit of a weaker version of that in the bill. And then number two, they did have what they call the Safety Supplemental title. And while that is nice, it is a small percent of the overall funding in the bill. The vast majority of the overall funding in that bill goes to the existing formula programs, which have created the unsafe streets that we're also familiar with. And so our attitude towards the Senate EPW bill is that they needed to take the good stuff and fund that and reorient the program around the safety and other things that they tried to do. Unfortunately, they did not. So let's talk a little bit about, on the next slide, the Complete Streets language that's in that bill. What they did was they set aside 2.5% of state and MPO planning dollars that could be used for a variety of things, including complete streets. But you can see some of the other things there: active transportation, transit access plans, transit-oriented development plans, regional intercity rail plans. And so while we were happy to see, some funding that could be used for complete streets, it's a far cry from the 5% of all highway funding that the Complete Streets Act called for. And it's not only for complete streets. It's for a variety of things, and there's no guarantee that a state might use it for complete streets. But also, it strains already limited planning funds. Taking 2.5% of state and MPO planning funds and requiring it to be used in this way won't solve the problem and undermines the ability of planners around the country to do their work. So we appreciated the nod at Complete Streets, but unfortunately weren't able to support this language. So that's the Senate. That's all that the Senate has done. I see the House slide up there, but just for some context, also in the Senate you have the Banking Committee, which has jurisdiction over transit. You have the Commerce Committee, which has jurisdiction over passenger rail, automated vehicles, and a whole bunch of safety issues. You have the Finance Committee, which has jurisdiction over how to fund any bill, how to make up the shortfall that I'm sure we've all heard about in the Highway Trust Fund. None of those committees have taken any action. And so an authorization bill is not going to be able to pass the Senate unless all of the committees can produce legislation and it can be combined together into a complete bill. So far, only the one committee has taken action. So now we'll move over to the House side. On the House side, you have a different committee structure. You have the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, which has jurisdiction over the majority of the transportation system. They have the Highway Subcommittee, which has jurisdiction over highways. They have a Transit Subcommittee, a Rail Subcommittee. And so they cover most of the infrastructure. You have the Science Committee, which has jurisdiction over a couple of things. You have Energy and Commerce Committee, which has some jurisdiction. You have the Ways and Means Committee, which, like the Finance Committee in the Senate, is responsible for determining how to fund a bill. Unlike in the Senate, none of these committees have taken any action. The Transportation and Infrastructure Committee has held a number of hearings, including a hearing on safety, but they have not set any kind of timeline for introducing a bill, and they have not been sharing with stakeholders such as ourselves any status updates or any draft text so far. On the House side, you really don't have anything moving. As we get closer and closer and closer to the FAST Act expiring next year, with so many other things that Congress has to deal with, I'm sure many of us can think of a few of those things. We're running out of time to pass a bill. And so it's Transportation for America's perspective that it looks like they will extend the authorization for some period of time as they continue to work on a brand new bill. So one of the things, as you look at the next slide, one of the things that we at Transportation for America really want to focus, and it relates directly, I think, to the Complete Streets Act, is that it's time to change the conversation. If you look at the hearings that have been happening on the House and Senate side, and you look at the markups on the Senate side during the EPW bill, a lot of the conversation, the overwhelming amount of the conversation has to do with funding. How are we going to pay for this bill? But it's the policy that matters. It's whether or not we actually invest in complete streets as opposed to the infrastructure we have today. And from Transportation for America's perspective, it's a question of whether you invest in passenger rail and transit and a whole host of things that we work on. Our current system is not set up to invest in these things, as we know. That's why we're here talking about the need to pass the Complete Streets Act. But if the conversation focuses solely on how are we going to make up the shortfall in the Highway Trust Fund, then we are concerned that we are missing an opportunity to talk about policies. What do we want to spend the billions of dollars that we bring in from the Highway Trust Fund, from the gas tax? What do we want to spend those dollars on? What should our communities look like? How can we best provide access to jobs and services? What do we value today? Do we value transit? Do we value pedestrian and cyclist fatalities and fixing that rather? And do we value safety? Or do we value high-speed car trips as the singular thing that's important to us? But when we focus only on the fact that the gas tax is not bringing in enough revenue and how that's a crisis and how we need to solve that, we're not talking about what it is we value. We're not talking about what any new money, should we find some, will be spent on. And we're concerned that what that means is Congress will throw together a bill and find some money under the couch cushions to just keep doing what we've been doing. So we really, at Transportation for America, in partnership with our colleagues at the Complete Streets Coalition, really want to have a conversation about policy. We really want members of Congress and members of the Senate to understand that our streets are dangerous by design, that our federal funding for highways, which is guaranteed, and which is the lion's share of the funding that's out there for transportation infrastructure, is making our streets more dangerous because we are not requiring complete streets design. We want to have that conversation, and then we want to turn their attention to the Complete Streets Act, which we think will change that. So that's really what we're trying to do at Transportation for America. And so we hope that in partnership with the Complete Streets Coalition, we can make a difference on the pedestrian safety crisis. So what can you do? You can take action, and as Emiko said, we're going to follow up, and we're going to share with you, precisely how you can do that. But members of the House and members of the Senate need to know how dangerous it is to be outside of a car in their district or in their state. They need to know how many people care about that, because so often, members of Congress hear about congestion on the roadways during peak hours, and maybe they don't hear as much about some of the other issues. And I was a former congressional staffer myself, and that was my experience. So we need folks on this call to speak up and to share how important pedestrian and cyclist safety is, and to let them know how dangerous their state and districts are, and then to support the Federal Complete Streets Act in the House and in the Senate. So the last thing I will say before wrapping up is that now is the time. As I said, the process is happening. The House has not yet acted. They have not released any kind of draft bill. Now is the time to affect what the House of Representatives does in their bill. And the Senate, did mention complete streets and did do some things that suggest, that there's an interest in safety. And so we think that's an opportunity for the House to take a really bold step and to leverage the steps the Senate took and go even further. So hopefully we can work together and take some action, and I will stop there. And I think we'll be taking some questions and look forward to hearing what you have to say. Thank you.
So if you have any questions, please feel free to write them in the bottom left corner of your screen. There's a little chat box. But we have put together some questions for Scott, which we will.
The first one I'm looking at is, when will the surface transportation bill be finalized and passed? That is a great question, and honestly, if I knew it, I would be somewhere else. I'd be on a beach somewhere because I'd be very, very wealthy, and I wouldn't be working anymore. The truth is the FAST Act is expiring next year. There's been a lot of conversation. I'm sure many of the folks on this call have heard it about negotiations between the White House and Congress. Several months back, there was discussion of a $2 trillion investment. There was a White House infrastructure proposal that was submitted along with their fiscal year 20 and then their previous budget, their fiscal year 19 budget. None of that has gone anywhere. Congress absolutely rejected the proposal in FY19 that the White House submitted, which was essentially that the federal government would be withdrawing and that the states and local communities should invest more and more in infrastructure as a way to rebuild and invest. Congress said no to that. In FY20, the White House proposed something a little bit different, but Congress has so far ignored that as well. The conversation around a $2 trillion investment, famously fell apart due to a variety of reasons, but certainly the White House and Congress, particularly the House and the White House, are at loggerheads right now. And so to date, there's really no clear path forward. The Senate took a step with their bill, as I mentioned, but because the House has not yet acted, because none of the other Senate committees have acted, we are a very long way out. Just for a sense of the process, they have to combine all the different pieces of a bill in the Senate and get that passed on the Senate floor, which takes a lot of time. And the House has to pass their own bill, which takes a lot of time. And then they have to reconcile the differences. And previous authorizations, for those of you who were paying attention, you know that Congress passed numerous extensions before they ultimately passed MAP 21 in 2012 and then the FAST Act in 2015. And so given the fact that Congress is months behind on their fiscal year 20 appropriations, which should have been wrapped up by now, given the fact that there's an impeachment inquiry going on, given the fact that there are a whole host of other issues, we at Transportation for America at least see it increasingly unlikely that a bill will be passed before the FAST Act expires. So we think an extension of some months, perhaps into the next administration, whether the president is reelected or not, is the likely path forward. But Congress can do what it wants, and they may surprise us, and so we're going to be monitoring things. But the last thing I'll say on this point is that the ideas that are written down now are what will inform the next authorization bill. And so that's why we need Congress to hear from you and for Congress to advance the Complete Streets Act, and for when the House puts out its proposal, whenever that may come, for it to include strong Complete Streets language and ideally the Complete Streets Act itself. Because when they get around to actually passing a bill, they're going to look at what passed the EPW committee, what passed the House, what have the committees looked at and approved. And we want the Complete Streets Act to be a part of that conversation. So even though it may be a while before an actual bill is passed into law, now's the time to get the Complete Streets Act on their radar. So the second question is, what kinds of projects can be funded by dollars from the Complete Streets Act, and who can receive that funding? There's a variety of different projects that can be funded. The bill includes some topics for emphasis. They want projects that identify the needs and respond to the needs of users of all ages and abilities. There's obviously technical assistance that's funded through this bill, so it would help communities identify the types and designs of facilities needed to serve each of those users. So basically what I'm getting at here is that the bill doesn't prescribe the specific policy and types of infrastructure that have to be funded. It's location and context specific. So there are a number of strategies that can be employed by communities to invest in complete streets. But what the bill does is it defines a complete street and lays out criteria that have to be considered, and then lets the local communities go from there. I think there's a second part of that question. Oh, who can receive the funding? So let me read to you who is eligible. Eligible entities are local communities in a state. States have to carry out the Complete Street program, and then the eligible entities are local communities within that state. So I hope that answers the question. Let's see. Question number 3 was, considering the heightened focus on climate, is there any consideration of aligning the reauthorization with climate action, such as reducing VNT, greater multimodal funding, etc.? Great question. One of the many things that was included in the Senate EPW bill that generated some positive press was the inclusion of a climate title. Climate change is mentioned in that bill, and there are programs to reduce carbon emissions on our roadways in that portion of the bill. At Transportation for America, we were very supportive of the concept, very supportive of the policies that they tried to enact within that portion of the bill, but very concerned that similar to the safety supplemental title, this funding was a drop in the bucket compared to the, I think it's $53 billion that would have been authorized for the current formulas under that bill. And so our position was that you're driving up vehicle miles traveled, you're investing in roadways that are not complete streets and are not safe with guaranteed formula funding that goes up to, I think it was $53 billion on the one hand, and then you're trying to fix all that and reduce your carbon emissions with a couple billion spread out over the life of the bill. And so that's just not enough. It doesn't fundamentally change what we invest in, how we invest, and it doesn't fundamentally change whether climate is a focus and a priority. And so we were happy to see that, and similar to what I mentioned about how the inclusion of some safety language and the complete streets language suggests that there's an opportunity for the House to go even further, we would say the same thing on climate, that this is a chance for the House really to go and do something that really shows that we can reduce greenhouse gas emissions in transportation. And just to touch on a final point on this, as the person said when they asked the question, or person probably knew when they asked the question, transportation is the largest emitter, transportation sector is the largest emitter of greenhouse gases in our country today. It's about 29%. Emissions in transportation are going up, and that's largely due to vehicle miles traveled. We're just driving so much that it is offsetting the gains that we're making from electric vehicles and CAFE standards. And so we hope that the House will do something related to that. And we think complete streets is a part of it. When you make streets safer for walking and biking, it means that people will take alternative forms of transportation. It means that they will walk and they will bike. It means that they might wait for the bus on that street as opposed to not doing that. They might take transit because it's safe and convenient to get to transit or to get to your final destination once you've gotten off of the transit. And so we think that those things are closely related and hope that we can make some progress on that. The next question, if local entities are eligible, what about state DOTs and state-owned roads? Are they accountable to the Complete Streets Act? Yeah, the answer is yes. States along with local entities, I'm sorry if I wasn't clear when I said that, but the requirements of the Complete Streets Act apply to states. States have to invest in their state-owned roads, and they have to address all the subject areas in the bill that focus on complete streets, and then they have to set up the statewide program to help their local communities, and so that's where I was saying that local communities are eligible. It's local communities that are eligible for the smaller grants that Emiko mentioned, which I think are $50,000 to actually build a project. But the states are, the requirements of the law, the bill apply to states as well. And states are required to carry out the technical assistance and provide the training, so they should be updated on everything that we want the local communities to be updated on as well. The last question that we have, and we certainly encourage folks to submit their questions, what congressional committee would be most effective to lead support of HR 3663, the Complete Streets Act. So the bill has been referred to the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, and so that is the committee that has jurisdiction. And so if you have a member of Congress who's on the House committee, that's the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, you certainly would want him or her to co-sponsor the bill. But the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, while it's one of, if not the largest committees in the House, it needs to hear from other members of Congress in order to make this a priority. So even if your Congress member is not on the committee, they need to hear from you. And so there's countless examples of that. We talked about climate change earlier. The leadership behind the Green New Deal, regardless of what you might think of that, is not on all of the committees that would be affected by the Green New Deal, but the energy that it's generated has put a lot of pressure on the committee leadership to act on climate change. And so the same is true on the Complete Streets Act. Members of Congress, regardless of whether they're on the committee, need to hear from you. They need to co-sponsor the bill, and that will send a signal to committee leadership and committee members that this is something they need to include in a bill. And then I don't want to overlook the Senate. The committee with jurisdiction in the Senate is the Environment and Public Works Committee. That's the committee that has passed the bills that I mentioned earlier. But that doesn't mean it's too late. We definitely need members of the Senate to co-sponsor the bill because the process is far from over. If they get to the point of debating a bill on the Senate floor, they will need support from the committee and the committee leadership to get perhaps the Complete Streets Act added as an amendment or to get it adopted through what they call a manager's amendment. But regardless of the technical process, it is far from late, and we strongly encourage, if your senator has not co-sponsored the Complete Streets Act, we strongly encourage him or her to do that as well. We got the next question: would local roads need to be on the federal aid system in order to qualify for funding? I don't believe that's true, but I will, in terms of how the bill works. I want to double check that, and so we will have to follow up with you after this call, but I'm fairly certain that we wrote the bill in such a way that that would not be the case, but I want to double check that. And since Emiko is no longer, I think, on the call, we'll get back with you. The last question, and again, if there's other questions, please don't hesitate to send them in, but the last question that we have now is, what are the objections to this effort? A couple of the things that we've heard are that there's limited money for infrastructure, and this bill would take 5% of that. But we don't see it that way. We're not taking 5% of it. We are just using it to, we're not, so no one's losing any money. It's just of the money you get, you have to spend 5% of it on complete streets. And so if you don't want to do that, that's a matter of concern from our perspective. If you want to invest all of your money in roadways that are not safe, that's a matter of concern. Another objection, which is similar to what I just said, is that local communities and states will sometimes say that they don't want to be told what to do. The name of the game in transportation in recent years in particular has been that the federal government provides more and more flexibility in exchange for accountability from the states. And so the argument would be, hold us accountable, ask us to improve safety, but let us do what we want in order to do that. Don't tell us how to do it. But as Emiko mentioned, and I'm just going to reiterate, what we've seen is that the accountability system hasn't worked. As the Dangerous by Design report shows, 18 states proposed in the most recent targets that they shared that injuries and fatalities would go up. And so what that means is that the federal program, the federal accountability program, is allowing them to set negative targets. And we think that's unacceptable. We think that they should be required to reduce injuries and fatalities every year. Otherwise, What are we doing? And so we don't think that the flexibility in exchange for accountability has been working. Fatalities and injuries are going up, not just in those 18 states, but they're going up nationwide. And so we think that it's time for something different. And so those are the two main objections that we've heard, and those are how we tend to respond to them. Are there any other questions? Well, as I understand it, there's no more questions, so I'm just going to reiterate that now is the time to act. We will be following up with a blog post that explains everything that we talked about here, a recording of this webinar, and a copy of our slides soon. So we strongly encourage, once we've done that, that you take a look at where your member of Congress and your senator are in relation to this bill, identify how dangerous your district may be, your state may be, and let your Congress member or senator know. And if you happen to be in one of the 18 congressional districts where somebody has co-sponsored it, or one of the 2 states where they've co-sponsored it, call them and say thank you. They need to know this is a priority. And again, when I was a congressional staffer, nobody calls to say thank you. They only call to tell you when you've done something wrong. And so there's a value in doing that as well. But certainly call those members who are not on the bill and encourage them to sign on. And then make sure to join the Complete Streets Coalition next month. We're going to be having another webinar, and it's going to be in partnership with Trust for America's Health. So unless there's any other questions, and I think that there are not, we'll just say thank you for tuning in and have a great rest of your day.